What if I told you that one of the most extraordinary acts of physical endurance and courage in Marine Corps' history came not from a decorated war hero with years of combat experience, not from an elite Force Recon operator with a chest full of medals, but from a 19-year-old recruit who her drill sergeant publicly mocked as too weak to carry her own pack? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What if I told you that this same drill sergeant, a man who had broken down hundreds of recruits over 15 years, a Marine who prided himself on separating the warriors from the wannabes, would eventually owe his life to the very girl he had dismissed as the weakest link in his platoon? This is the story of Private Autumn Reeves, and how being labeled as fragile, inadequate, and destined to fail became the fuel that would power one of the most incredible displays of strength, determination, and heroism the military has ever witnessed. But this isn't just a story about physical strength. This isn't just about a small-town girl proving wrong a veteran drill instructor who thought he knew everything about what makes a Marine. This is about how our deepest assumptions about human capability can blind us to the extraordinary potential that exists in the most unexpected places. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison had seen it all during his decade and a half as a drill instructor at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Parris Island. He had transformed thousands of civilians into Marines, had pushed recruits beyond their breaking points, and had developed what he believed was an infallible ability to identify who had what it took to earn those Eagle, Globe, and Anchor insignia. Morrison, the science was simple. Physical strength determined mental toughness, size indicated capability, and past athletic achievement predicted future military success. He had built his reputation on these assumptions, and in 15 years, he had rarely been proven wrong. His methods were harsh but effective, his standards uncompromising but fair, and his ability to spot weakness was legendary among his peers. Then Autumn Reeves arrived at Parris Island. At 5 feet 2 inches and barely 110 pounds. She looked more like someone who belonged in a college library than a Marine training facility. She had no sports background, no military family tradition, and no obvious physical advantages that typically characterize successful recruits. When she struggled through her first physical fitness test, when she lagged behind during initial conditioning hikes, when she appeared to buckle under the verbal pressure that every recruit faces, Morrison was certain he had identified another recruit who would either quit or be removed from the program. What Morrison didn't know, what nobody at Parris Island knew, was that Autumn Reeves had been carrying weight her entire life. Not the kind of weight you measure in pounds, but the kind that builds a strength that can't be detected in a standard fitness evaluation. Growing up in the rural mountains of West Virginia, Autumn had spent her childhood as the primary caregiver for her disabled younger brother, while her single mother worked 3 jobs to keep their family afloat. She had carried him up and down mountain trails when his wheelchair couldn't navigate the terrain. She had lifted him countless times when he couldn't support his own weight. She had developed a type of functional strength and endurance that came not from a gym or athletic field, but from years of necessity, love, and determination that refused to quit. But at Parris Island, none of that mattered. What mattered was how you performed in the first few weeks, how you measured against standardized metrics, and whether you fit the profile of what a Marine was supposed to look like. And by every visible measure, Autumn Reeves didn't fit that profile. Morrison made his assessment quickly and definitively. Private Reeves was weak, unsuited for military service, and destined to become another statistic, one more recruit who discovered that wanting to be a Marine wasn't enough when you lacked the physical foundation to handle the demands. He was about to learn how catastrophically wrong assumptions can be, because 12 weeks later, during a training exercise that would go horribly wrong in the unforgiving wilderness of the South Carolina backcountry, when heat exhaustion and dehydration would drop the supposedly strongest Marines in the platoon, when a medical emergency would leave Staff Sergeant Morrison unconscious and dying 5 miles from the nearest rescue point. It would be Private Autumn Reeves, the girl he had labeled as too weak to succeed, who would literally carry him to safety. This is the story of how wrong we can be when we judge strength by appearance, capability by first impressions, and potential by past performance. This is the story of how the most unlikely hero can emerge from the most dismissive environment. And this is the story of how one drill sergeant learned that sometimes the weakest looking recruit can teach the strongest lessons about what it truly means to never leave a fallen comrade behind. By the end of this story, you'll never look at strength the same way again. You'll understand why the most powerful force in the world isn't muscle or training or experience. It's the unbreakable will of someone who refuses to be defined by other people's limitations. This is Autumn Reeves' story, and it will change everything you think you know about what makes someone truly strong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Private Autumn Reeves stepped off the bus at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island, on a sweltering June morning, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder and her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and determination. At 19 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed only 110 pounds soaking wet. Among the sea of recruits filing through the gates, she looked like someone who had accidentally gotten on the wrong bus. The other recruits towered over her. There was Riley Patterson, a former college linebacker from Texas who looked like he could bench press a pickup truck. Marcus Webb had been a high school wrestling champion who still carried himself with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to physical dominance. Sarah Chun had been a competitive CrossFit athlete whose muscled frame spoke of years spent in serious training facilities. And then there was Autumn, who looked like a strong wind might knock her over. To the drill instructors conducting their initial assessments, she was immediately categorized. Too small, too delicate, too obviously unprepared for the physical and mental demands of Marine Corps training. When she struggled to hoist her sea bag onto the bunk during their first night in the squad bay, when she finished dead last in their initial formation run, when her voice barely carried above a whisper during their first attempt at martial cadence, the consensus was clear. Staff Sergeant Morrison took one look at her during that first week and made his judgment. Here was another idealistic young woman who had watched too many military movies and confused inspiration with capability. She would wash out within the first month, probably during the initial physical fitness test or the first real conditioning hike. He had seen dozens like her over the years, and they all followed the same predictable pattern: initial enthusiasm, gradual reality check, eventual surrender to the truth that wanting something wasn't enough when you lacked the foundation to achieve it. During chow time, Autumn sat quietly at the end of the table, methodically eating her meals while the other recruits talked about their athletic backgrounds, their workout routines, their confident expectations about earning their Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. She didn't contribute to these conversations because she had nothing comparable to share. No varsity letters, no personal training records, no stories of dominating opponents or achieving athletic milestones. What she had instead was a quiet intensity that most people mistook for shyness or uncertainty. While other recruits boasted about their capabilities, Autumn was studying everything around her with the focused attention of someone who had learned early in life that survival depended on understanding your environment completely. She watched how the stronger recruits moved during PT, analyzed the techniques that seemed most efficient, observed which approaches led to success and which resulted in punishment or failure. To everyone else at Paris Island, she was the recruit who would probably become a statistic. The drill instructors saw her as a problem waiting to happen. Her fellow recruits, when they noticed her at all, saw her as someone who was clearly in over her head. Even the support staff who processed new arrivals looked at her paperwork and wondered How someone with her apparent limitations had made it through the initial screening process. But Autumn Reeves had something that couldn't be measured in a physical fitness test or detected during an initial interview. She had spent the first 18 years of her life carrying weight that others couldn't see, developing strength that didn't show up in conventional assessments, and learning that the most important battles were won not through superior size or obvious advantages, but through the simple refusal to quit when quitting would be the reasonable choice. She had a secret that would soon change everything at Paris Island. She just didn't know it yet. What the Marine Corps' intake forms didn't reveal about Autumn Reeves was that she had grown up in the hollers of Braxton County, West Virginia, in a world where strength wasn't measured by how much you could bench press or how fast you could run a mile. In the mountains of Appalachia, strength was measured by how much weight you could carry when there was no other choice, how far you could walk when someone's life depended on it, and how long you could endure when giving up meant someone you loved would suffer. Autumn's childhood had ended abruptly when she was 8 years old and her younger brother Caleb was diagnosed with spina bifida. The condition left him partially paralyzed from the waist down, confined to a wheelchair, and dependent on others for mobility in a world that wasn't designed for his limitations. Their father had disappeared within 6 months of the diagnosis, unable to handle the reality of raising a disabled child in rural poverty. Their mother, Rebecca, had been forced to take on multiple jobs to cover medical expenses and basic living costs, often working 16-hour days between her position at the local diner, her evening cleaning job at the county courthouse, and her weekend shifts at a gas station. This left 8-year-old Autumn as Caleb's primary caregiver during the long hours when their mother was away working. But their home was a small trailer situated halfway up a mountain slope, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became impassable during winter months. The nearest school was 3 miles away. The closest grocery store was 5 miles in the opposite direction, and the local hospital was a 20-minute drive when the roads were good and nearly an hour when they weren't. Caleb's wheelchair was useless on mountain terrain. The rocky paths, steep inclines, and uneven ground that characterized their daily environment made traditional mobility aids completely ineffective. If Caleb needed to get anywhere beyond the immediate vicinity of their trailer, someone had to carry him. And during the countless hours when Rebecca was at work, that someone was always Autumn. By the time she was 10, Autumn was routinely carrying her brother distances that would challenge grown adults. When Caleb needed to get to the school bus pickup point, she carried him half a mile down a steep, winding path every morning and back up every afternoon. When he wanted to visit their grandmother who lived 2 miles away through dense forest, Autumn would hoist him onto her back and navigate the treacherous terrain, often making the round trip multiple times if Caleb needed assistance or if weather conditions required multiple supply runs. During the brutal West Virginia winters, when snow made the mountain paths even more dangerous and inaccessible, these carries became matters of survival rather than convenience. When Caleb developed pneumonia at age 7 and needed immediate medical attention, Autumn carried him nearly 4 miles through knee-deep snow to reach the main road where an ambulance could meet them. When flooding washed out the bridge that connected their hollow to the rest of the county, Autumn spent 3 days carrying supplies and helping evacuate elderly neighbors, including multiple trips carrying Caleb to safety. But the real test of her endurance came during what their family would later refer to as the lost weekend. Autumn was 14 and Caleb was 10 when they became separated from a family hiking group during a camping trip in the Monongahela National Forest. While the adults were setting up camp, the children had wandered off to explore a nearby creek. When a sudden summer storm rolled through the mountains, the group became disoriented in the dense forest, and Autumn found herself responsible for getting Caleb back to civilization. With no compass, no cell phone coverage, and rapidly deteriorating weather conditions, Autumn made the decision to carry Caleb toward what she hoped was the general direction of the main trail. For 36 hours, she navigated through unmarked wilderness, carrying her brother on her back for distances that park rangers later estimated exceeded 12 miles of extremely difficult terrain. She crossed 3 separate mountain ridges, forded 2 swollen creeks, and maintained her pace through a night of steady rain that left them both soaked and hypothermic. When they were finally found by a search and rescue team, Autumn was still walking, still carrying Caleb, still moving toward what her instincts told her was safety. The rescue coordinator, a veteran with 20 years of experience in mountain recovery operations, later told their mother that he had never seen anything like Autumn's endurance and determination. Most adults would have stopped after the first few miles and waited for help. Autumn had simply kept walking because stopping wasn't an option when her brother's life depended on her strength. These experiences had developed in Autumn a type of functional fitness that bore no resemblance to conventional athletic training. Her muscles were lean and efficient rather than bulky and impressive. Her cardiovascular system had been conditioned not through interval training or structured workouts, but through years of sustained effort under real-world conditions where failure meant genuine consequences. Her mental toughness hadn't been forged in competitive environments where the worst outcome was losing a game, but in situations where giving up could result in serious injury or death. More importantly, she had learned to manage pain and discomfort in ways that most people never experience. She understood the difference between the kind of pain that indicated injury and the kind that simply indicated effort. She knew how to pace herself for distances that seemed impossible, how to find reserves of strength when her body insisted it had nothing left to give, and how to maintain focus and decision-making ability even when physical exhaustion threatened to cloud her judgment. But none of this was visible on a Marine Corps application or detectable during a standard physical fitness evaluation. On paper, Autumn looked like exactly what she appeared to be: a small-town girl with no athletic background, no military family tradition, and no obvious qualifications for the demanding world of Marine Corps training. The drill instructors at Parris Island had no way of knowing that the seemingly fragile recruit who struggled with their initial fitness assessments had already proven herself capable of feats of endurance that would challenge their most elite graduates. They couldn't see that her quiet demeanor masked a level of mental toughness that had been tested under conditions far more severe than anything they could create in a controlled training environment. All they saw was what appeared to be another idealistic young woman who had overestimated her capabilities and underestimated the realities of military service. They had no idea that Autumn Reeves had been preparing for this challenge her entire life, developing exactly the kind of strength and endurance that would soon be needed in ways none of them could imagine, while other recruits at Parris Island spent their limited free time writing letters home, polishing boots, or collapsing from exhaustion onto their racks. Autumn Reeves was quietly conducting her own advanced education in human movement and endurance optimization. What her fellow Marines interpreted as antisocial behavior was actually the methodical study habits of someone who had learned early in life that survival depended on understanding every available advantage. During the brief windows between official training sessions, when most recruits were focused on meeting basic requirements and avoiding punishment, Autumn was analyzing the biomechanics of every physical challenge they encountered. She studied the recruits who excelled at different exercises, breaking down their techniques into component parts that she could adapt to her own smaller frame and different leverage points. When Patterson dominated the obstacle course with his raw upper body strength, Autumn was memorizing his hand placements and timing. When Chun powered through conditioning hikes with seemingly effortless endurance, Autumn was observing her breathing patterns and stride mechanics. But her real education was happening during the pre-dawn hours, when she would wake 30 minutes before reveille and conduct her own supplementary training in the narrow space between her rack and the squad bay wall. While her platoon mates slept, She was performing isometric exercises she had learned from carrying Caleb through mountain terrain, developing the specific type of functional strength that came from supporting another person's weight over extended distances. These weren't the explosive, high-intensity movements that characterize traditional military fitness training. Instead, Autumn was focusing on the sustained, low-level contractions that allowed muscles to maintain effort for hours, rather than minutes. She practiced what she privately called carrying positions, testing different ways to distribute weight across her frame, experimenting with hand grips and body angles that would minimize fatigue during extended load-bearing activities. Most intensive self-education was taking place during the conditioning hikes that were designed to build mental toughness and physical endurance in the recruit platoons. While other Marines focused on simply completing these exercises within the prescribed time limits, Autumn was treating each hike as a laboratory for testing theories about pace management, breathing optimization, and mental focus techniques. On their third-week conditioning hike, a 6-mile route through the humid South Carolina countryside with full packs and equipment, Autumn discovered something that would later prove crucial. While recruits around her were struggling with the prescribed pace, fighting against their loads, and battling mental fatigue, she found that she could maintain the required speed while actually conserving energy by applying lessons learned from her years of mountain carrying. The key was treating the pack not as an external burden to be endured, but as an extension of her own center of gravity that could be managed and optimized through proper positioning and movement patterns. Instead of fighting against the weight, she learned to work with it, using slight adjustments in posture and stride to transform what felt like an impossible load into something manageable. During the 7th week, crucible preparation exercises, when the drill instructors began introducing sleep deprivation and extended physical challenges designed to simulate combat stress, Autumn realized that her mountain experiences had given her advantages that went far beyond simple physical conditioning. The mental strategy she had developed during those long carries with Caleb, the ability to maintain focus and decision-making capability, even when her body was screaming for rest, translated directly to the psychological challenges of military training. While other recruits were discovering their breaking points during extended physical challenges, Autumn was operating in a mental space she had occupied many times before. The combination of physical exhaustion, time pressure, and high-stakes consequences was familiar territory for someone who had navigated genuine survival situations in the West Virginia wilderness. But perhaps most importantly, she was developing an understanding of human endurance that went beyond conventional military training doctrine. Through careful observation of how different recruits responded to various challenges, combined with her own experimentation during unofficial training sessions, Autumn was building a comprehensive knowledge base about optimizing human performance. Under extreme conditions, she noticed that the recruits who relied primarily on raw physical strength were the first to fail during extended challenges. Their impressive initial performances gave way to rapid deterioration when exercises exceeded their anaerobic capacity. Conversely, recruits who had developed more efficient movement patterns and better mental management strategies could maintain performance levels far beyond what their apparent physical capabilities would suggest. This led Autumn to develop what she thought of as invisible training, techniques for building the specific type of strength and endurance that would be needed for real-world applications rather than simply meeting standardized fitness requirements. She learned to identify the difference between training that looked impressive and training that produced practical results. During their night navigation exercises, when recruits were required to move through unfamiliar terrain with minimal visibility and limited equipment, Autumn discovered that her mountain background had given her spatial awareness and terrain reading abilities that exceeded those of Marines with far more obvious athletic credentials. She could move through difficult terrain with less noise, less energy expenditure, and better route finding accuracy than recruits who had dominated more conventional physical challenges. her expertise was becoming particularly evident in scenarios that combined physical endurance with problem-solving under stress. While other recruits would become mentally compromised when physical fatigue reached certain levels, Autumn had learned to maintain clear thinking even when her body was operating at the edge of its capabilities. This cognitive endurance, developed through years of making critical decisions while carrying Caleb through dangerous mountain terrain, represented a type of training that couldn't be replicated in conventional military preparation. By the 8th week of training, Autumn had developed capabilities that none of the drill instructors recognized or understood. Her official fitness scores remained mediocre by Marine Corps standards, but her actual capacity for sustained performance under extreme conditions exceeded that of recruits who scored significantly higher on standard evaluations. She had become an expert in human endurance optimization, specializing in the specific challenges of carrying additional weight over extended distances under adverse conditions. It was a highly specialized skill set that had no obvious application in the structured environment of recruit training, but it was exactly the expertise that would soon be needed when everything went wrong in the South Carolina wilderness, and conventional military training would prove insufficient for the challenges they were about to face. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison had built his reputation at Paris Island on his ability to identify weakness and eliminate it before it could contaminate the fighting spirit of an entire platoon. In 15 years of turning civilians into Marines, he had developed what he considered an infallible system for separating those who belonged in the Corps from those who were simply wasting everyone's time with misguided fantasies about military service. Morrison's approach was brutally direct and deliberately public. When he spotted a recruit who he determined was unsuitable for Marine service, he didn't simply counsel them privately or suggest alternative career paths. Instead, he made them an example, using their failures as teaching moments for the rest of the platoon about the unforgiving standards required to earn the title of Marine. Autumn Reeves had become his primary target within the first week of training. "Reeves!" Morrison's voice would echo across the training grounds every morning during PT formation. "Are you planning to participate in these exercises, or are you here to observe how real Marines train?" The question was rhetorical, designed not to elicit a response, but to establish in front of 43 other recruits that Private Reeves was fundamentally different from her peers, fundamentally inadequate for the challenges ahead. When Autumn struggled to complete the required number of pull-ups during their weekly fitness assessments, Morrison would position himself directly in front of her, counting each incomplete repetition in a voice loud enough for the entire platoon to hear. That's not a pull-up, Reeves. That's wishful thinking. Try again. 2. Still not seeing your chin clear the bar. Are you sure you're on the right bus route? Maybe you meant to sign up for yoga class instead of Marine Corps training. During conditioning hikes, when Autumn would finish within the prescribed time limits, but typically in the bottom quarter of the platoon, Morrison made it his personal mission to ensure that her performance became a focal point for group discussion. During the post-exercise debriefs, let's talk about what we observed today. We had Marines who completed this exercise like Marines. We had Marines who completed this exercise with room for improvement. And then we had Private Reeves who completed this exercise like someone who's confused about what organization she joined. The psychological assault was systematic and unrelenting. Morrison had identified what he believed was a fundamental mismatch between Autumn's capabilities and the demands of military service, and he was determined to force her to confront this reality as quickly as possible. In his experience, recruits like Autumn would either quit voluntarily within the first month or be removed from the program during the more intensive training phases. Either outcome was preferable to allowing someone unsuitable to continue wasting resources and potentially endangering other Marines through their inadequacy. "You know what I see when I look at you, Reeves?" Morrison asked during one particularly brutal PT session. positioning himself inches from her face while she struggled through a set of mountain climbers. I see someone who watched too many movies about military service and confused inspiration with capability. I see someone who thinks wanting something is the same as being qualified for it. I see someone who's going to get real Marines killed because she couldn't be honest about her limitations. The attacks weren't limited to physical performance. Morrison had developed a comprehensive critique of everything about Autumn that he considered evidence of her unsuitability for military service. Her quiet demeanor became lack of leadership potential. Her methodical approach to learning new skills became inability to adapt quickly under pressure. Her tendency to focus intensely on technique rather than simply pushing through exercises with raw effort became overthinking simple tasks that real Marines handle instinctively. During their 6th week of training, when the platoon was learning advanced combat movements, Morrison used Autumn's careful attention to proper form as an opportunity for one of his most devastating public humiliations. "Reeves, this isn't a dance recital where we award points for artistic interpretation. This is combat training where hesitation gets Marines killed. You can't think your way through a firefight. You can't analyze your way through an ambush. Either you have the instincts and physical capability to respond effectively under pressure, or you don't. And everything I've observed tells me you don't." The rest of the platoon had learned to expect these daily demonstrations of Morrison's contempt for their struggling classmate. Some recruits felt uncomfortable with the intensity of his attacks on Autumn, but none dared to intervene or express disagreement with their drill instructor's assessment. Morrison's reputation for identifying recruits who would ultimately fail was well established, and challenging his judgment would only invite similar scrutiny of their own performance. Other recruits began to internalize Morrison's characterization of Autumn as fundamentally different from real Marines. Patterson, the former linebacker who had initially been friendly toward Autumn, gradually stopped acknowledging her during meals or free time. Shun, who had offered to help Autumn with some of the physical challenges during their first weeks, began treating her with the polite distance typically reserved for recruits who were expected to wash out of the program. That the message was clear and consistently reinforced. Autumn Reeves didn't belong at Parris Island, didn't possess the qualities necessary for military service, and was fundamentally unsuited for the demands of being a Marine. Morrison's assessment wasn't presented as opinion or personal preference, but as objective reality based on professional experience and observable evidence. 15 years of doing this job, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, Morrison announced to the platoon during one of their evening instruction sessions, that Marine Corps training reveals who you really are under pressure. It strips away pretense and self-deception. It shows you whether you have what it takes or whether you've been fooling yourself about your capabilities. Some recruits discover they're stronger than they thought. Others discover they're weaker than they hoped. Private Reeves has discovered she's in the wrong place entirely. But Morrison's systematic campaign to break down Autumn's confidence and force her departure was having an unexpected effect. Instead of crushing her determination, his constant criticism was crystallizing her resolve. Each public humiliation, each dismissive comment, each prediction of her inevitable failure was adding fuel to a fire that had been burning since her childhood. In the mountains of West Virginia, Morrison had made one critical miscalculation in his assessment of Private Autumn Reeves. He had mistaken her quiet intensity for weakness, her thoughtful approach for hesitation, and her unconventional background for inadequate preparation. He was about to learn that some forms of strength are invisible until the moment they become absolutely essential for survival. The crisis that would change everything at Parris Island began developing 3 days before anyone realized the danger. A massive heat dome had settled over the southeastern United States, bringing temperatures that meteorologists were describing as potentially lethal for extended outdoor activities. The heat index was climbing toward 115 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity levels that made the air feel thick enough to cut with a knife. Despite the extreme weather warnings, the training schedule of Parris Island continued without modification. The Marine Corps had built its reputation on the ability to operate effectively under any environmental conditions, and a little summer heat wasn't considered sufficient reason to alter carefully planned training exercises. Staff Sergeant Morrison, in particular, viewed the oppressive conditions as an additional opportunity to separate recruits who possessed genuine Marine Corps toughness from those who were simply going through the motions. Real Marines don't get to postpone combat operations because the weather isn't comfortable, Morrison announced during their Tuesday morning formation. Enemy forces don't check the temperature before launching attacks. If you can't handle it, Little Carolina summer heat, you sure as hell can't handle the conditions you'll face in actual military operations. The exercise that was scheduled for Thursday morning was called the Crucible Preparation March, a 15-mile conditioning hike through the remote wilderness areas of the Parris Island training grounds. Unlike the shorter conditioning hikes they had completed during earlier phases of training, this exercise was designed to simulate the sustained physical and mental stress of extended combat operations. Recruits would carry full combat loads including weapons, ammunition, water, food, and emergency equipment, totaling approximately 70 pounds of additional weight. The route would take them through some of the most challenging terrain available. In the South Carolina Lowcountry, dense forests with minimal shade, sandy paths that would sap energy from every step, and several creek crossings that would add the challenge of wet boots and equipment to an already demanding exercise. Under normal weather conditions, the march would push most recruits to their physical and mental limits. Under the current heat dome conditions, it was approaching the threshold of what could be considered safe for extended physical activity, but Morrison was convinced that backing down from the challenge would send the wrong message to his recruits about Marine Corps standards and expectations. These young people needed to understand that military service involved operating under conditions that civilian life would consider unreasonable or dangerous. Better to teach them this lesson in a controlled training environment than have them discover it during actual combat operations where lives depended on their ability to perform regardless of circumstances. The night before the exercise, Autumn spent her usual pre-dawn period conducting her private supplementary training, but this time she was specifically preparing for heat management under extreme conditions. Her experience carrying Caleb through West Virginia summers had taught her valuable lessons about maintaining physical performance when environmental conditions pushed the human body toward its breaking points. She understood that heat exhaustion didn't announce itself gradually. Instead, it typically struck suddenly when the body's cooling systems became overwhelmed and began shutting down critical functions. The key to preventing heat-related casualties was recognizing the early warning signs before they became visible to outside observers and taking preventive measures that most people wouldn't consider necessary until it was too late. During her mountain carries, Autumn had learned to monitor not just her own hydration and core temperature, but also the subtle changes in Caleb's condition that might indicate developing heat stress. She had developed an intuitive understanding of how different body types responded to prolonged exposure to high temperatures and humidity, and she had learned to identify the specific combination of factors that created the highest risk for heat-related medical emergencies. What concerned her most about Thursday's planned exercise wasn't the distance or the terrain, both of which fell within her demonstrated capabilities. Instead, she was worried about how her fellow recruits would handle the combination of extreme heat, heavy loads, and the psychological pressure to maintain pace regardless of physical condition. Many of the recruits who had dominated earlier physical challenges had never been tested under conditions where environmental factors could overwhelm even superior athletic conditioning. Patterson, despite his impressive size and strength, came from Texas where he had trained primarily in air-conditioned facilities. His muscular frame, which provided significant advantages during explosive exercises, would become a liability during sustained activity in extreme heat because larger muscle mass generated more internal heat while providing less surface area for cooling. Chun, whose endurance had been exceptional during moderate weather conditions, had never been tested under the kind of environmental stress that could cause even well-conditioned athletes to collapse suddenly and unexpectedly. Morrison's plan for the exercise reflected his standard approach to challenging conditions: maintain the prescribed pace regardless of circumstances, push through discomfort without complaint, and prove that Marines could accomplish their missions even when conditions became difficult. He had selected the most physically impressive recruits to serve as pace setters, assuming that their superior conditioning would allow them to maintain standards that the rest of the platoon could follow. But Autumn recognized that Morrison's strategy contained a fundamental flaw. The recruits he had chosen as pace setters were exactly the ones most likely to experience sudden, catastrophic heat exhaustion under the planned conditions. Their superior performance during moderate weather conditions had been based on physical attributes that would become disadvantages rather than advantages when environmental stress exceeded certain thresholds. As she prepared her equipment for the next morning's exercise, Autumn realized that she possessed knowledge about heat management and crisis prevention that could be critical for her fellow recruits' safety. But she also knew that any attempt to share this information would be dismissed as another example of her tendency to overthink simple situations rather than trust in conventional military training methods. Morrison had made it clear that her insights and observations were not welcome, that her role was to follow instructions rather than contribute analysis or recommendations. The systematic campaign to marginalize her voice had created a situation where potentially life-saving information would remain unheard until it was too late to prevent a crisis. Thursday morning arrived with temperatures already climbing toward dangerous levels before sunrise, and humidity so thick that uniforms were soaked with perspiration before the exercise even began. The 15-mile Crucible preparation march began at 05:00 hours under a sky that was already showing the first warning signs of what would become a catastrophic day. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, the air temperature was hovering near 85 degrees with humidity so thick that it felt like breathing through wet wool. Morrison had positioned himself at the front of the formation, setting a pace that he considered appropriately challenging for Marines in training. "Listen up, recruits," Morrison's voice carried across the formation as they prepared to move out. "Today we find out who has what it takes to operate under real-world conditions. The enemy doesn't care if you're hot, tired, or uncomfortable. Neither do I. We maintain pace, we complete the mission, and we prove that Marines can accomplish anything regardless of circumstances." Autumn had positioned herself in the middle of the formation, close enough to observe the recruits Morrison had selected as pace setters, but far enough back to avoid drawing his attention during the early phases of the march. She had already noticed concerning signs that the larger, more muscular recruits were going to struggle with heat management as conditions worsened throughout the morning. Patterson, despite his impressive physical conditioning, was already showing elevated breathing patterns and excessive perspiration rates that indicated his body was working harder than optimal to maintain the prescribed pace. Chun, whose endurance had been exceptional during moderate weather exercises, was displaying the slightly rigid posture and forced breathing that Autumn recognized as early indicators of developing heat stress. By the third mile, when the sun had fully risen and temperatures were climbing rapidly toward dangerous levels, Autumn could see that Morrison's strategy of using the physically strongest recruits as pace setters was creating exactly the crisis she had feared. The recruits who looked most capable of handling extreme conditions were actually the ones most vulnerable to sudden, catastrophic heat exhaustion. At the 4-mile mark, when they paused for their first official hydration break, Autumn made a decision that violated everything Morrison had taught them about proper communication protocols. She approached Patterson, who was showing increasingly obvious signs of heat distress, despite his attempts to maintain the appearance of effortless performance. "Patterson," she said quietly, trying to avoid drawing Morrison's attention. "You need to slow your pace and increase your water intake. Your cooling system is becoming overwhelmed." Patterson looked at her with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What are you talking about, Reeves? I'm fine. Maybe worry about keeping up with the pace instead of offering advice to Marines who aren't struggling like you are." Autumn tried a different approach with Chen, who was displaying even more concerning symptoms. "Chun, your breathing pattern indicates developing heat exhaustion. You need to modify your pace and cooling strategy before." "Reeves." Morrison's voice cut across the formation like a rifle shot. "What part of maintain formation discipline confused you? You're supposed to be focusing on your own performance, not playing drill instructor with Marines who are actually meeting standards." Morrison strode over to where Autumn was standing, his face flushed with anger and the increasingly oppressive heat. "Let me make this crystal clear, Private. You are the weakest link in this platoon. You are the recruit most likely to fail this exercise. You have no business offering advice to Marines who are performing at levels you'll never achieve. Your job is to follow, not lead. Your job is to learn, not teach. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Autumn replied, but she continued to monitor the condition of her fellow recruits with growing alarm. Morrison's public humiliation had effectively silenced any further attempts to share her observations about developing heat casualties. But it hadn't eliminated her ability to recognize that they were heading toward a medical emergency. By the 7th mile, when the heat index had climbed above 110 degrees and the formation was moving through a section of dense forest that blocked any cooling breeze, the first signs of serious trouble began appearing. Webb, another of Morrison's selected pace-setters, began showing the subtle coordination issues that indicated his body's cooling systems were becoming overwhelmed. His normally smooth, efficient movement patterns were becoming slightly erratic, and his responses to Morrison's commands were delayed by fractions of a second. Autumn recognized these symptoms immediately from her experiences with heat exhaustion during mountain carries in West Virginia. Webb was entering the dangerous transition zone where heat stress was beginning to affect cognitive function and motor control. Without immediate intervention and cooling measures, he would progress rapidly to heat stroke and potential collapse. When she attempted to catch Morrison's attention to report her observations, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Reeves, I told you to focus on your own performance. Webb is a real Marine who can handle whatever conditions we encounter. Stop looking for excuses to slow down the entire formation." At the 9-mile point, disaster struck with the sudden, catastrophic nature that Autumn had been dreading. Patterson, who had been pushing himself to maintain pace despite increasingly obvious heat distress, suddenly stumbled and went down hard on the sandy trail. His collapse wasn't gradual or preceded by obvious warning signs that Morrison could recognize. One moment he was marching with apparent determination. The next moment he was unconscious on the ground with his body temperature spiking toward lethal levels. Morrison immediately called for the formation to halt and rushed to Patterson's position. But his training in heat casualty management was limited to basic first aid protocols that weren't adequate for the severity of Patterson's condition. Within minutes, it became clear that Patterson was experiencing severe heat stroke and needed immediate medical evacuation to prevent permanent injury or death. Chun, Webb, establish radio contact with base and request emergency medical extraction. Morrison ordered, but when he turned to his other selected leaders, he discovered that they were also showing signs of significant heat exhaustion and were in no condition to take on additional responsibilities. For the first time since the exercise began, Morrison's confidence in his assessment of the platoon's capabilities began to waver. The recruits he had identified as most capable of handling extreme conditions were either unconscious or approaching their own breaking points. while the recruit he had dismissed as weakest was still fully functional and appeared to be the only member of the formation who had accurately predicted the developing crisis. "Reeves," Morrison said, his voice lacking its usual commanding authority. "Help me get Patterson into recovery position while we wait for medical extraction." But as Autumn knelt beside Patterson's unconscious form and began implementing the heat stroke treatment protocols she had learned during her mountain rescue experiences, she realized that medical extraction might not be possible under current conditions. The extreme heat that had caused Patterson's collapse would also ground helicopter operations, and ground-based medical vehicles couldn't reach their current position deep in the wilderness training area. They were 9 miles from the nearest road, 6 miles from the nearest facility with medical cooling equipment, and Patterson's condition was deteriorating rapidly in a way that wouldn't allow them to wait for external rescue. Morrison was about to discover that all his assumptions about strength, capability, and leadership were dangerously wrong, and that the recruit he had spent months trying to break was the only person present with the knowledge and ability to save Patterson's life. Within 15 minutes of Patterson's collapse, the situation had deteriorated from a training exercise into a full-scale medical emergency that was spiraling beyond Morrison's ability to control. The radio communications with base had confirmed Autumn's worst fears. No helicopter medical evacuation would be possible due to the extreme heat conditions, and ground-based emergency vehicles couldn't navigate the wilderness trails to reach their current position. Patterson's condition was becoming critical with alarming speed. His core body temperature had spiked to dangerous levels. His skin had taken on the dry, flushed appearance that indicated his body's cooling systems had completely shut down, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow in a way that suggested multi-organ stress. Without immediate intervention involving aggressive cooling measures and professional medical care, he would likely suffer permanent brain damage or death within the next hour. But the crisis was expanding beyond Patterson's heat stroke. Chun, who Morrison had dispatched to establish communications with base, had collapsed while attempting to use the radio equipment. Her symptoms were different from Patterson's, but equally concerning: profuse sweating, nausea, and a kind of disorientation that indicated her body was still attempting to cool itself, but was rapidly approaching the point where her systems would also shut down completely. Webb, the third member of Morrison's selected leadership group, was still conscious but showing increasingly obvious signs that he was following the same trajectory toward heat exhaustion that had already claimed his fellow pacesetters. His responses to Morrison's instructions were becoming delayed and confused. His coordination was deteriorating noticeably, and his speech was beginning to show the slight slurring that indicated developing neurological impairment. Morrison found himself facing a command crisis that his 15 years of drill instructor experience had never prepared him to handle. The 3 recruits he had identified as most capable of handling extreme conditions were either unconscious or rapidly becoming non-functional, while the remaining members of the platoon were looking to him for leadership in a situation that was clearly beyond his expertise. "Rodriguez Davis, establish a defensive perimeter while we wait for ground-based medical evacuation," Morrison ordered, but his instructions reflected his growing panic rather than sound tactical thinking. They weren't facing enemy contact that required defensive positions. They were facing an environmental emergency that required immediate medical intervention and evacuation planning. "Sir," Rodriguez replied, his voice reflecting the confusion that was spreading through the platoon. "What kind of perimeter? We're not under attack. We need to focus on getting Patterson and Chun to medical care before their conditions get worse." Morrison's response revealed the extent to which the crisis had undermined his confidence and decision-making ability. "Just establish security positions and monitor the situation. Ground evacuation should be here within 2 hours." But Autumn knew that 2 hours would be far too long for Patterson's survival, and possibly too long for Chun as well. Heat stroke casualties required aggressive cooling measures within minutes, not hours, and the environmental conditions that had caused their collapse were continuing to worsen as the morning sun climbed higher and temperatures approached the day's predicted peak. She also knew that Morrison's plan to wait for ground-based evacuation contained a fundamental flaw that he either didn't understand or was choosing to ignore. Their current position was approximately 6 miles from the nearest point accessible to emergency vehicles, through terrain that would require at least 2 hours of difficult hiking under optimal conditions. Under current heat conditions, attempting to evacuate heat stroke casualties on foot would likely result in additional casualties among the evacuation team. Autumn made a decision that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She approached Morrison directly, ignoring the protocols about communication hierarchy that had been drilled into every recruit since their first day at Paris Island. "Sir, we need to implement immediate cooling measures for Patterson and prepare for manual evacuation. Ground-based medical teams won't be able to reach us in time, and waiting for conditions to improve could result in fatalities." Morrison's response was immediate and furious. "Reeves, I've had enough of your unauthorized assessments and recommendations. You are not qualified to make medical decisions or evacuation plans. Your job is to follow orders, not question command decisions, based on your civilian fantasies about military operations." "Sir," Autumn persisted, knowing that she was risking severe disciplinary action, but understanding that Patterson's life was more important than military protocol. "I have experience with heat stroke management from mountain rescue situations. Patterson needs aggressive cooling right now, and we need to begin moving him toward evacuation points before his condition deteriorates further." Morrison's face had taken on the dangerous flush that indicated his own heat stress was beginning to affect his judgment and emotional control. "You have experience with nothing that applies to this situation. You are a failed recruit who has consistently demonstrated that you lack the physical and mental capabilities required for Marine Corps service. The fact that you think your hillbilly camping trips qualify you to override trained military medical protocols just proves how delusional you've become about your own competence." But as Morrison was delivering this tirade, Webb suddenly collapsed next to Chun, bringing the total number of heat casualties to 3 and leaving Morrison with a situation that was clearly beyond his ability to manage using conventional approaches. The remaining conscious recruits were looking around with increasing panic as they realized that their drill instructor's leadership was becoming increasingly erratic and ineffective. Davis, one of the more experienced recruits who had served in the National Guard before joining the Marines, approached Morrison with barely concealed concern. "Sir, we need to take immediate action to stabilize these casualties. Whatever our normal protocols might be, they're not working under these conditions." Morrison's response revealed how completely the crisis had undermined his confidence and authority. "We follow established procedures. We maintain discipline. We wait for professional medical evacuation. That's how the Marine Corps operates, and that's what we're going to do." But Autumn could see that Morrison's insistence on following normal procedures was going to result in preventable deaths. Patterson's breathing was becoming increasingly labored. Chun was showing signs of advancing dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, and Webb's collapse indicated that the environmental conditions were continuing to overwhelm even the strongest members of the platoon. The temperature was still climbing toward the day's predicted peak of 118 degrees. Humidity was remaining at dangerous levels, and they were still 6 miles from the nearest point where professional medical care could reach them. Morrison's strategy of waiting for external rescue was a death sentence for the casualties who needed immediate intervention. Autumn realized that she was facing the same kind of life or death decision she had confronted during her childhood in West Virginia, when waiting for help wasn't an option and survival depended on taking action based on knowledge and capabilities that others couldn't see or understand. The difference was that this time, instead of carrying her disabled brother through mountain wilderness. She would need to carry 3 heat stroke casualties through hostile terrain, while a drill instructor who had spent months undermining her authority tried to prevent her from implementing the only plan that might save their lives. The unexpected voice that cut through Morrison's increasingly frantic attempts to maintain control came from Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, a senior drill instructor who had been conducting her own training exercise approximately 2 miles away when she received the emergency radio transmission about heat casualties in Morrison's platoon. Santos had 22 years of military experience, including multiple combat deployments and extensive training in field medicine and crisis management. More importantly, she had developed a reputation throughout Paris Island for her ability to assess situations quickly and make decisions based on tactical reality, rather than adherence to procedures that might not apply under extreme circumstances. She arrived at Morrison's position with 2 other instructors and immediately began conducting her own assessment of the crisis, starting with the 3 unconscious recruits and then evaluating the condition of the remaining platoon members. Her approach was methodical and professional, but it became clear within minutes that she was reaching conclusions that differed significantly from Morrison's analysis. "Morrison, what's your current evacuation plan?" Santos asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. In crisis situations, Morrison's response revealed how much the situation had shaken his confidence. "Ground-based medical evacuation is en route. Estimated arrival in 90 minutes. We're maintaining position and providing basic first aid until professional medical teams can take over treatment." Santos knelt beside Patterson and quickly assessed his condition, checking pulse, breathing, skin temperature, and neurological responses. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she completed her evaluation. "These casualties need aggressive cooling and immediate evacuation. Waiting 90 minutes for ground transport through 6 miles of wilderness isn't going to work. We need alternative solutions." "Ma'am," Morrison replied, "we're following established protocols for medical emergencies in field training environments. Ground evacuation is the safest approach under current conditions." But Santos was already moving to examine Chun and Webb, and her assessment was leading her to conclusions that challenged Morrison's entire approach to managing the crisis. After completing her medical evaluation, she turned her attention to the remaining conscious members of the platoon, asking specific questions about their condition, their hydration status, and their capacity for continued physical exertion under extreme heat conditions. When she reached Autumn, Santos paused and conducted a more detailed assessment than she had with the other recruits. "Private, how are you feeling? Any signs of heat exhaustion, dehydration, or fatigue that might compromise your ability to function effectively?" Autumn's response was measured and precise. "No significant heat stress, ma'am. Adequate hydration and core temperature management. Capable of sustained physical exertion under current conditions." Santos studied Autumn with the focused attention of someone who had learned to identify capability and reliability under pressure. "What's your assessment of the current situation and our available options?" Morrison immediately intervened. "Ma'am, Private Reeves is not qualified to provide tactical or medical assessments. She's demonstrated throughout training that she lacks the expertise and judgment required for leadership responsibilities." But Santos held up a hand to silence Morrison while maintaining eye contact with Autumn. "I asked for the private's assessment. Let her respond." Autumn took a deep breath, knowing that this might be her only opportunity to present the analysis she had been developing since the crisis began. "Ma'am, the 3 casualties require immediate aggressive cooling and evacuation to medical facilities within the next 30 to 40 minutes to prevent permanent injury or death. Ground-based evacuation won't reach us in time, and the terrain between here and accessible roads will create additional heat casualties if we attempt to carry them out using conventional methods. Santos nodded, encouraging her to continue. What alternative approaches would you recommend? We need to establish an immediate cooling station using available water supplies and shade materials. Begin rapid but sustainable evacuation toward the nearest accessible point, and modify our movement techniques to prevent additional heat casualties among the evacuation team. The key is treating this as a load-carrying operation over extended distance, rather than a conventional medical evacuation. Morrison's face had gone from flushed to pale as he realized that Santos was taking Autumn's assessment seriously. Ma'am, Private Reeves has consistently demonstrated poor judgment and inadequate understanding of military procedures. Her recommendations are based on civilian experiences that don't apply to proper military medical protocols. Santos turned to Morrison with an expression that suggested she was reaching her own conclusions about his leadership during this crisis. Staff Sergeant, I've reviewed the condition of your casualties and evaluated the tactical situation. Private Reeves' assessment aligns with my own analysis. Your plan to wait for ground evacuation will likely result in preventable fatalities. She turned back to Autumn with the focused attention of a senior leader who had identified someone with critical capabilities. Private, you mentioned load-carrying operations over extended distance. Do you have specific experience or training in that area? Autumn met Santos' gaze directly. Yes, ma'am. Extensive experience carrying casualties through difficult terrain under adverse conditions. I understand the biomechanics, pacing strategies, and risk management techniques required for sustained load bearing over distances that exceed normal tactical parameters. Santos made her decision with the swift authority of someone accustomed to command in crisis situations. Private Reeves, you're taking point on evacuation planning. Morrison, you're providing support and coordination. We're implementing immediate cooling measures and beginning evacuation toward the nearest accessible point for ground medical teams. Morrison's protest was immediate and desperate. Ma'am, this is highly irregular. Private Reeves is not qualified for leadership responsibilities. She's demonstrated throughout training that she lacks the physical and mental capabilities required for high-stress situations. But Santos had already shifted into crisis management mode, and her focus was on results rather than protocol. Staff Sergeant, your selected pace setters are unconscious. Your evacuation plan was inadequate for current conditions, and Private Reeves appears to be the only member of this platoon who accurately predicted the developing crisis and possesses the specific expertise needed to resolve it. She turned to the conscious members of the platoon, who had been watching this exchange with growing understanding that their survival might depend on accepting leadership from the recruit their drill instructor had spent months trying to break. Down, listen up, Marines. We have 3 critical casualties who need immediate evacuation under conditions that are going to test everyone's capabilities. Private Reeves has the specialized knowledge and experience needed to get us through this crisis. You will follow her instructions exactly and without question. Is that understood? The response from the platoon was immediate and unified. Yes, ma'am. For the first time since arriving at Paris Island, Autumn Reeves found herself in a position where her knowledge and capabilities were not only recognized but desperately needed. The recruit who had been dismissed as too weak to succeed was now responsible for saving the lives of the same people who had written her off as inadequate for military service. Santos placed her hand on Autumn's shoulder with the gesture of a POMVU, senior leader passing critical responsibility to someone she trusted to handle it effectively. Private, these Marines are counting on you. Show us what you can do. Autumn Reeves stood in the oppressive South Carolina heat, looking down at 3 unconscious Marines, whose lives now depended on her ability to translate years of mountain carrying experience into a military medical evacuation that conventional training hadn't prepared anyone else to execute. The weight of command authority that Sergeant Santos had placed on her shoulders felt familiar in a way that surprised her. similar to the countless moments in West Virginia when Caleb's safety had depended entirely on her decisions and capabilities. First priority is immediate cooling for all 3 casualties, Autumn announced to the assembled platoon, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had managed genuine survival crises before. Rodriguez and Davis, I need you to establish a shaded cooling station using ponchos and any available materials. Create maximum airflow and prepare to implement evaporative cooling techniques. While the designated Marines moved to follow her instructions, Autumn knelt beside Patterson and began implementing heat stroke treatment protocols that went far beyond the basic first aid that Morrison had been attempting. She had learned these techniques during mountain rescue situations where professional medical care was hours away and survival depended on field improvisation using available resources. Chun and Webb are showing different stages of heat exhaustion, but Patterson has progressed to heat stroke with neurological involvement, she explained to Santos while beginning aggressive cooling measures that involve strategic placement of wet clothing on major pulse points and creating airflow patterns that would maximize heat dissipation. We need to bring his core temperature down rapidly while maintaining circulation and preventing shock. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she repositioned Patterson's body to optimize cooling, checked his airway and breathing, and began the systematic cooling process that could mean the difference between recovery and permanent brain damage. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from a textbook. This was expertise developed through real-world experience managing heat emergencies in mountain environments where mistakes had life or death consequences. Santos, we have approximately 25 minutes before Patterson's condition becomes irreversible, Autumn continued, her assessment based on observations of heat stroke progression that she had witnessed during emergency situations in West Virginia. Ground evacuation teams won't reach us in time, which means we need to begin manual evacuation immediately while continuing cooling measures during transport. Santos nodded, recognizing the authority in Autumn's voice and the precision of her medical assessment. What's your evacuation plan? Autumn stood and pointed toward the terrain features that would define their route back toward civilization. We're currently 6 miles from the nearest point accessible to emergency vehicles. The direct route follows the original march path, but that terrain will be unsuitable for casualty evacuation under current heat conditions. We need to modify our route to optimize shade coverage, minimize elevation changes, and provide rest points for cooling intervention. She moved to a position where the entire platoon could see her and began outlining an evacuation strategy that none of them had encountered in their military training, but which made immediate tactical sense given their current crisis. We're going to establish a leapfrog evacuation system, Autumn explained, using hand gestures to illustrate her plan. 3-person carrying teams will rotate at quarter-mile intervals to prevent additional heat casualties among the evacuation personnel. Each team carries 1 casualty for approximately 15 minutes, then transfers to the next team while moving to cooling positions. Morrison, who had been silently watching this dramatic reversal of authority, finally found his voice. Private, this isn't how we conduct military medical evacuations. We have established procedures for casualty movement that don't involve experimental techniques developed by untrained personnel. But Autumn turned to face Morrison with a level of confidence that no one at Paris Island had ever seen from her before. Staff Sergeant, your established procedures have resulted in 3 heat stroke casualties and a situation that conventional military medical protocols can't resolve. We're 6 miles from professional medical care, operating under environmental conditions that exceed standard safety parameters, and dealing with casualties who will die if we continue following approaches that aren't working. She gestured toward Patterson, whose condition had stabilized slightly under her cooling interventions, but who remained critically dependent on continued treatment. I have extensive experience managing heat emergencies and conducting long-distance Casualty evacuation through difficult terrain. This isn't experimental. This is applied expertise developed through situations that were more challenging than what we're facing today. Santos stepped forward, clearly impressed by Autumn's systematic approach and professional demeanor under extreme pressure. Private, break down the specific techniques you'll be using for casualty transport. I need to understand how this differs from standard evacuation procedures. Autumn moved to Patterson's position and demonstrated the carrying techniques she had refined during years of transporting Caleb through West Virginia mountain terrain. Standard military carries are designed for short distances with frequent personnel rotation. We need techniques optimized for sustained transport over extended distances while maintaining medical stability for the casualties. She positioned herself to illustrate the biomechanics involved. The key is distributing weight across the strongest muscle groups while maintaining airway protection and circulation monitoring. We use modified fireman's carries with integrated cooling measures, allowing us to continue medical treatment during transport rather than treating evacuation and medical care as separate activities. The demonstration revealed expertise that went far beyond anything the other recruits had encountered during their training. Autumn's techniques were efficient, sustainable, and specifically adapted for the environmental and medical challenges they were facing. More importantly, her confidence and competence were having a visible effect on the morale and focus of the remaining platoon members. Rodriguez, Davis, and Martinez will form the first carrying team, Autumn continued, assigning roles based on her assessment of each recruit's current condition and capability for sustained physical exertion. Johnson, Williams, and Chun will establish the first relay point at quarter-mile intervals. We maintain continuous communication, monitor all personnel for heat stress, and modify pace as conditions require. She turned to address the entire group with the authority of someone who had assumed complete command responsibility for their survival. This evacuation will succeed because we're going to execute it with the same precision and teamwork that defines Marine Corps operations. The difference is that we're adapting our techniques to meet the specific challenges we're facing, rather than trying to force inappropriate procedures into an emergency situation. Santos nodded approvingly. Private Reeves, implement your evacuation plan. All personnel will follow your instructions without question. We move out in 5 minutes. As the platoon began organizing themselves according to Autumn's detailed instructions, Morrison found himself watching the recruit he had spent months trying to break down take command of a crisis that had overwhelmed his own leadership capabilities. For the first time since arriving at Parris Island, Autumn Reeves was exactly where she belonged, leading Marines through a challenge that required every lesson she had learned during her childhood in the mountains of West Virginia. The evacuation that followed would be remembered at Parris Island as one of the most extraordinary displays of leadership and endurance in the history of Marine Corps recruit training. Under Autumn's command, the modified platoon began moving through the South Carolina wilderness with a level of coordination and efficiency that seemed impossible given the extreme conditions and the severity of their medical emergency. The leapfrog system that Autumn had designed worked exactly as she had predicted. The first carrying team, Rodriguez, Davis, and Martinez, lifted Patterson using the specialized techniques she had demonstrated, distributing his weight in ways that allowed them to maintain a sustainable pace while continuing the cooling measures that were keeping his core temperature within survivable ranges. Every 15 minutes, they would transfer Patterson to the next team while moving to shaded positions where they could recover and monitor their own heat levels. What impressed Santos most was Autumn's ability to maintain oversight of the entire evacuation while simultaneously managing the most critical medical aspects of their situation. She moved constantly between the 3 casualty evacuation teams, adjusting carrying techniques, monitoring the condition of both casualties and evacuation personnel, and making real-time decisions about pace and route modifications based on changing environmental conditions. Chun's condition is stabilizing, Autumn reported to Santos during the second relay transfer, after conducting a quick medical assessment of the recruit who had regained consciousness but remained weakened by heat exhaustion. She can walk with assistance, which will allow us to concentrate carrying resources on Patterson and Webb. We need to maintain hydration protocols and monitor for any signs of relapse. Her medical assessments were proving remarkably accurate. Patterson's condition had not only stabilized under her treatment protocols, but was actually showing signs of improvement as they maintained aggressive cooling during transport. Webb had regained consciousness during the first quarter mile and was able to walk with minimal assistance, though Autumn insisted on continuing to monitor his neurological status for any signs of secondary complications. The carrying techniques that Autumn had taught the evacuation teams were proving far more effective than standard military procedures would have been under these conditions. The modified fireman's carries she had demonstrated allowed the teams to maintain Patterson's position in ways that kept his airway clear and his circulation stable while distributing his weight across multiple muscle groups to prevent rapid fatigue among the carrying personnel. More importantly, her understanding of pace management was preventing additional heat casualties among the evacuation team. While Morrison's original approach had pushed the strongest recruits to their breaking points, Autumn's system was designed to operate within sustainable limits that could be maintained over the full 6-mile distance to the evacuation point. Quarter mile. Checkpoint 2, Autumn announced as they reached the second relay position. All carrying personnel report status. Medical check on all casualties. Hydration break for everyone not currently engaged in transport duties. Her command presence was remarkable to observe. The same recruit who had been dismissed as too weak for leadership responsibilities was now managing a complex medical evacuation involving multiple casualties, a dozen personnel, and environmental conditions that were still climbing toward the day's temperature peak. Her instructions were clear, her assessments were accurate, and her decision-making was consistently sound under pressure that would have challenged experienced combat leaders. Morrison, who was following the evacuation as additional personnel, rather than in any leadership capacity, found himself watching Autumn's performance with a mixture of amazement and growing understanding of how completely he had misjudged her capabilities. Every aspect of his assessment of her potential as a Marine was being systematically disproven by her response to genuine crisis conditions. The most telling moment came at the halfway point of their evacuation, when environmental conditions reached their absolute peak and several members of the evacuation team began showing early signs of heat stress that could have created additional casualties. Autumn immediately recognized the developing problem and implemented modifications to their procedures that addressed the new challenges without compromising the medical care being provided to the original casualties. "We're adjusting to double team carries for the next quarter mile," she announced, quickly reorganizing their personnel assignments to distribute the physical load more effectively while providing additional recovery time for personnel who were approaching their limits. Rodriguez and Martinez, you're on Patterson with Johnson providing cooling support. Davis and Williams, you're on backup ready to rotate in at 5-minute intervals. Her modifications worked perfectly. The increased personnel rotation prevented any additional heat casualties while maintaining the pace necessary to get Patterson to professional medical care within the critical time window. Her understanding of human endurance under extreme conditions was proving superior to conventional military training approaches that hadn't been designed for the specific challenges they were facing. At the 4-mile point, when they could finally establish radio contact with the ground-based medical teams, Autumn's assessment of their timing proved remarkably accurate. Medical 1, this is evacuation team. We have 1 critical heat stroke casualty showing significant improvement under field treatment, 2 stable heat exhaustion cases, and 12 additional personnel in good condition. Estimated arrival at evacuation point in 35 minutes. The response from the medical team revealed their surprise at the effectiveness of the evacuation. Evacuation team, we were preparing for multiple critical casualties based on initial reports. Your field treatment and evacuation procedures appear to have prevented what could have been multiple fatalities. Santos, who had been monitoring Autumn's performance throughout the evacuation, approached her during the final rest break before their arrival at the evacuation point. Private Reeves, I need to understand something. Where did you learn these medical treatment techniques and evacuation procedures? This level of expertise doesn't come from standard first aid training. Autumn's response revealed the depth of real-world experience that had prepared her for exactly this type of crisis. Ma'am, I spent 12 years managing heat emergencies and conducting casualty evacuation through mountain terrain in West Virginia. My younger brother has spina bifida, and I was responsible for his care and transport through environments that were often more challenging than what we've encountered today. Santos nodded with the understanding of someone who recognized genuine expertise when she encountered it. Private, what you've accomplished today represents the kind of leadership and technical competence we hope to develop in our most experienced Marines. You've saved lives through knowledge and capabilities that went far beyond anything we could have taught you in conventional training. As they approached the final quarter mile before reaching the evacuation point where professional medical teams were waiting, Autumn realized that she had not only saved Patterson's life, but had also demonstrated capabilities that would fundamentally change how everyone at Parris Island understood her potential as a Marine. The recruit who had been dismissed as too weak to succeed had just led one of the most successful emergency evacuations in the recent history of Marine Corps training, proving that true strength comes in forms that can't always be measured by conventional standards. 6 months after the evacuation that saved 3 lives in the South Carolina wilderness, Staff Sergeant Autumn Reeves stood before a classroom of new drill instructor candidates at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot, her uniform bearing the chevrons of her recent promotion and the ribbons that reflected her rapid rise through the ranks following her graduation from Parris Island. The promotion had come with unusual speed for someone so early in her Marine Corps career, but the circumstances that had led to her recognition were equally unusual. The after-action report from the heat stroke evacuation had been distributed throughout the Marine Corps Training Command as a case study in adaptive leadership under extreme conditions. Autumn's techniques for long-distance casualty evacuation had been incorporated into official training protocols, and her approach to heat emergency management was now taught to drill instructors across all Marine Corps training facilities. The most dangerous assumption we can make as military leaders, Autumn told the assembled instructor candidates, is that we can identify capability and potential based on first impressions or conventional metrics. The recruit who struggles with standardized fitness tests might possess exactly the type of specialized knowledge that saves lives when conventional approaches fail. In the back of the classroom, Colonel James Mitchell, the commanding officer of the recruit depot, observed the lesson with the satisfaction of someone who had made the right decision in unusual circumstances. The recommendation to promote Autumn directly from recruit to instructor training had been controversial, but the results had vindicated his judgment in ways that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The transformation in Marine Corps training culture that had followed Autumn's success was remarkable to observe. Drill instructors throughout the system had begun paying closer attention to recruits who demonstrated non-traditional strengths, looking for expertise and capabilities that might not be immediately obvious through standard evaluation methods. The rigid categorization of recruits into strong and weak, based primarily on physical appearance and initial performance, had given way to more nuanced assessments that considered diverse backgrounds and experiences. Patterson, Chun, and Webb had all graduated from Parris Island and were now serving as Marines in various specialties throughout the Corps. Patterson had specifically requested assignment to a unit where he could work with Autumn again, crediting her not only with saving his life but with teaching him lessons about leadership and strength that had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to be a Marine. When I was lying unconscious in that South Carolina heat, Patterson had written in his recommendation for Autumn's promotion, "The strongest person in our platoon wasn't the biggest or the most athletic. It was the person who had developed real-world capabilities through experiences that prepared her for challenges that conventional training couldn't simulate." The ripple effects of Autumn's story had extended far beyond Paris Island. Her techniques for heat emergency management were being taught at military medical facilities. Her evacuation procedures had been adopted by search and rescue organizations, and her approach to identifying hidden capabilities in personnel had influenced leadership training across multiple branches of the military. Morrison, whose leadership during the crisis had been found inadequate by the official investigation, had been reassigned to administrative duties and eventually retired from the Marine Corps. His departure had been handled quietly, but the lessons from his failure to recognize Autumn's capabilities had become part of the standard curriculum for drill instructor training. Staff Sergeant Morrison made a fundamental error that nearly cost lives, Colonel Mitchell had explained during a leadership conference for senior training personnel. He allowed his preconceptions about what strength looks like to blind him to actual strength when it was present in his unit. Our job as military leaders is to identify and develop capability wherever we find it, not to impose our assumptions about what capability should look like. The most significant change, however, was in how the Marine Corps approached the identification and development of specialized expertise within its ranks. Autumn's background in mountain rescue and long-distance carrying had been invisible to conventional evaluation processes, but it had proven invaluable when conditions exceeded the parameters of standard military training. New assessment protocols now included detailed interviews about civilian experiences and specialized skills that might have military applications. Recruits with backgrounds in wilderness survival, emergency medical care, technical rescue, or other specialized areas were identified early, and their expertise was incorporated into training planning rather than overlooked or dismissed. Most valuable capabilities often come from unexpected sources. Autumn continued her lecture to the instructor candidates. Our responsibility is to create an environment where those capabilities can be recognized and developed rather than suppressed by rigid adherence to conventional models. Santos, who had been promoted to Master Sergeant and was now responsible for advanced instructor training, often used Autumn's story as an example of how crisis situations could reveal leadership potential that might otherwise remain hidden. Private Reeves demonstrated more effective command presence during that evacuation than some Marines develop after years of leadership training, Santos explained to her students. The difference was that her expertise had been tested under real-world conditions where the stakes were life and death. The composition notebook that Autumn had kept during her time as a recruit, documenting her observations about training effectiveness and personnel management, had been analyzed by Marine Corps leadership development experts and had contributed to reforms in how drill instructors approached individual assessment and mentoring. Today, that notebook was displayed in the Paris Island Museum as part of an exhibit about adaptive leadership and the importance of recognizing diverse forms of strength within military organizations. The exhibit included testimonials from Patterson, Chun, and Webb about how Autumn's leadership had saved their lives, along with analysis of how her unconventional background had prepared her for challenges that conventional military training hadn't anticipated. As Autumn concluded her lecture and dismissed the instructor candidates, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed recruit to respected leader within the Marine Corps training establishment. The mountains of West Virginia that had shaped her childhood now seemed like preparation for exactly the kind of challenges she faced as a military leader responsible for developing the next generation of Marines. Her story had become more than Just an individual success, it had become proof that strength comes in many forms. That capability can't always be predicted by conventional measures, and that the most valuable assets in any organization might be found in the most unexpected places. The girl who had been labeled too weak for combat had not only proven her critics wrong but had transformed the very system that had tried to limit her potential. She had shown that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in meeting expectations, but in exceeding them in ways that no one thought possible. Standing in the empty classroom, looking out at the training grounds where new recruits were beginning their own journeys toward becoming Marines, Autumn smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had found exactly where she belonged, not despite her unconventional background, but because of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.